And we are back. This is Colombia Calling, episode 493. 493 episodes, 10 plus years on the air. My very special guest has been on a few times, but not for several years. Paula Delgado Kling, Colombian, living in New York. We've been talking, previously in I mean, it's more than pre-pandemic because there's always before pandemic and post-pandemic. We were talking about her book, and her book is about the lost childhood of a young lady. And I know that it goes into Paula's, I know it kind of runs parallel to Paula's upbringing as well in Colombia. So we're going to talk about all of these things and hear her side of events and about this book, which I believe is going to be launched in a shop called Books and Books on January the 28th in Coral Gables at 4 p.m. So therefore, you have to all be there, my Florida listeners. Paula, welcome back on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Hi, Richard. It's so nice to be back.
It's a real pleasure. It's been a while, but the last time we saw one another was in New York, pre-pandemic.
It was when we were walking around.
when we were. I mean, I don't know. I felt young and beautiful back then. I now feel old and haggard post-pandemic, and 2 children.
Right.
It's awful. Paula, it's exciting because it's been more than a decade. I mean, I've been working on my own book for more than a decade, and you've been working on this book for some time. Well, just give us the title and how it came about.
So the book is called Leonor, The Story of a Lost Childhood. And it came about because I was a graduate student at Columbia University. I was in the International Affairs program at CIPA. And I wanted to write a paper about child soldiers and the child rights policy in Colombia towards child soldiers. This was 2001. It was the Pastrana government. And I could not find any information in regards to child soldiers. I did find a book or so or two, like several sources about the Shining Path movement. But of course, it was very dated. It didn't apply to Colombia. So I reached out to Human Rights Watch. And Jose Miguel Vivanco was incredibly supportive and kind. And he put me in touch with Sebastian Brett and Robin Kirk. Mm-hmm. And they're the Colombia field people for Human Rights Watch. And it turned out that they were in the middle of editing a report on child soldiers in Colombia. And this was the background to the book in a way. In the end, I was able to corroborate a lot of what this young woman told me because of this report from Human Rights Watch. Because, of course, it's always very difficult to present it to publishers and say, well, this happened. Well, how? She's unreliable. Okay, well, it's corroborated by Human Rights Watch, some reports from Amnesty International. So then the next thing was I flew home to Bogota, and I was able to visit some of the group homes where some of these former child soldiers were being housed under government care. And I met this young woman, Leonor. She was kind, and we spent several days. Then we kept in touch over the years, over the months, over the years. And this conversation for this book took place over 19 years. So a book came out of a paper when I was 27 years old in graduate school.
Leonor is no longer a child. Has she got children of her own?
Neither are we. I was 27 and now you guys do the math. It was 2001. Yeah. And so, but the issue was that what she thought she knew in 2001 wasn't the entire truth. And she was 17 years old. And we know 17-year-olds, they also have their teenage hormones and other ideas about what may or may not be that their parents went through. So it took her a lot of time and therapy and patience and reuniting with her mother and having calm conversations with her mother to really distill what it was that had happened to her. Because in her view, something entirely different had happened. And we know that 17-year-olds, imagine a 17-year-old in those circumstances and fighting with the parents and put in domestic abuse and put in poverty, lack of education, displacement. And how can a 17-year-old truly know what happened to her with patience?
Where in Colombia is Leonor from?
She's from Putumayo. So she was born in the Puerto Guzman, Puerto Leguizamo area, and her family ended up displaced from their farms in those areas, and she ended up moving with her mother to Mocoa, and arriving there as a young girl. When Mocoa was not this bigger city, small city bigger town, smaller city that it is now. So they were able to squat on some land that to this day, the land they squatted on is where they all live.
And you've been able to follow in her footsteps. You've been with her down to Putumayo, and you've been with her to her family.
Not go to Putumayo. It logistically, it was not a risk I wanted to take. So we spoke on the telephone a lot, over Facebook. And the telephone actually was a better kind of source, because without looking at another person, there tends to be less emotion. So you just say whatever's on your mind without having to worry about how the other person's facial expressions come about as to like, oh, that was really, really bad that happened to you or whatnot. So she just spoke her mind, and the telephone actually ended up kind of more like a way for her to just chat and relieve herself.
And Leonor has children of her own now?
Leonor has two little girls. One of them was born in a group home. And the other one was born, I guess again in a group home, because she was in the group home for like 25 years. But one of them was born when Leonor was relatively younger. And the other one, I guess, like more with a studier partner who's no longer her partner. But both, yes, she's got two little girls who are no longer little girls, really. Like they were 4 a couple of years ago, so 8, 9, 10.
I asked because obviously, what she grew up experiencing, she obviously doesn't want for her little girls.
So we did talk a lot about that, because that was one of her biggest concerns, because she did return to live in Mocoa, and her biggest concerns were her girls facing the same sorts of hardships that she faced. Because when she returned, it was this, even though she had gone through government therapy, and even though she had had other experiences and she'd lived in various different regional zones of Colombia, from Eje Cafetero to Bogota to different areas. She even lived in Giron for a while. Her community and her family had not. So they were still stuck in time and still saw things the way they had forever, which had led her to join the FARC.
And I mean, so she was in the FARC. She joined up at 17. Was she a victim?
At 17. That's what she said to me when she was fresh out of the FARC. 2 weeks. So I met Leonor 2 weeks after she was out of the FARC. And she said, I joined when I was 17. But through the years, as we retraced, so what I think perhaps she also sensed in me a kind of therapist, because I had the notes of different parts of her life in different areas. And she'd go back and say, no, that didn't happen this way. It happened this way. So growing up in Mocoa for children, and this is very common, is that they do certain favors for armed groups. And the armed groups, drug trafficking, whatnot, is integrated very much into their community. It's walking down the street and seeing it, suddenly, okay, you're involved in some way and you see it, and your uncle, your aunt, whoever, they're all in the fabric of these groups just by where they live. So Leonor and her mother did not get along very well. Okay, again, she was a teenager. We all know teenagers now, right? She wanted certain freedoms. Her mother was trying to protect her, possibly also seeing things that Leonor did not see at the time that her mother wanted to protect her. So Leonor would find refuge in the FARC camps. And from what I understand from her is that a lot of kids, teenagers, go to the FARC camps because it's a free meal. There's also booze, there's dancing, there's freedom, there's unsupervised time with other kids. So she would go back and forth. But along with unsupervised, you can imagine all the other stuff that happened in a country like Colombia, where there's a lot of machismo, so to speak. So she would go back and forth until finally there was one day where this commander took a look at this beautiful little, not little anymore, but beautiful blooming girl and said, "You're staying." And that was the end of her back and forth of living at home. And yeah, she said she was 11 years old, 12 years old, because what she also clearly explained to me is that to be with a virgin or to be with the youngest is a privilege for the commanders, the purest. So along with that, he gave her a lot of STDs and problems through the years that still linger to this day. 11, 12 years old. On the other hand, she's very resourceful. She's whip smart, like in any other place, you know, she would have thrived to the top. Because how does an 11-year-old girl survive in a male-dominated group? This is something of somebody who's really smart to have turned the situation around and to have accommodated it in her mind to think, well, no, I can actually do something with this. I found in Leonor true resilience and grit. So she found through the commander that although all these really bad sexual stuff was going on with abuse with him, she was also still able to get certain things for herself and carve out a position in which, because she was la compañera del comandante, the commander's, I don't know what, it's not really truly girlfriend. What is it? Like,
mistress?
But it's a little bit more than mistress, because it's almost wife in a way.
Would we just say pareja?
Or first girl?
Yeah.
First girl, because it's not truly compañera. Like first commander's first girl, let's say.
The favored one.
Got a lot of privileges as well that allowed her to stay alive, to not be sent into combat, to sometimes live in a home, not in a home, in a house with running water and a roof over her head.
So she wasn't a combatant.
In the end, she was a combatant, and that is how the government captured her, was able to take her into the government home for rehabilitation.
And you met her in the government home. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like?
So if I think back now, I am glad I was 27 years old and just really eager and ambitious to get a story, because it was a tough group of kids, a tough environment. They spend their day watching TV, lounging around, but they also get to go to the park, play basketball, be kids again. Some of the government homes in the warmer climate have a pool, and it's a chance for them to laugh for a few hours in the pool to forget that they were in war and that their situation, and be children again. And so the government's prime goal to begin with is to give back a little bit of childhood, which all children deserve.
Sure. But hers was it in Bogota, or she was moved around?
Yes.
South?
It was throughout. It was different homes throughout.
Okay, I just find it. I can imagine it being not dissimilar to the small kind of orphanages, the sort of barrio orphanages that they have. But is there security? Because of course the stigma surrounding someone to have come out of the FARC and the children, I mean, surely they're placed in secure homes.
Yes and no. It's not that there's security out front, but I also did have to go through several leaps to get clearance to be able to visit. And I understand that was a long haul for me to have been able to do that.
Cool. Now, I mean, the story of Leonor obviously is fascinating in as much as it's tragic, but also now we look at the positivity of her out of the FARC, looking after her children, I suppose, life. What kind of socioeconomic situation is she in now?
So she's back to where she started. She's considered a success case. She went through 25 phases of the government program. When she returned to Mocoa, she did not want to continue with government therapy because she didn't want to leave her girls alone for a few hours, and there was no government program in Mocoa for her, no government psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist. So back to her situation. Again, she's resourceful, and the way she tells it, however we choose to see it, but sometimes women have to do what women have to do. And so she relies a lot on her live-in boyfriend, who, ironically enough, is a former paramilitary.
Do they have political arguments?
She says that's the one rule they have, in which they don't talk about anything politics.
Okay.
And that they have separate friends and separate groups, but they still love each other.
Well, that's good. And I mean, I guess, was he in the Águilas Negras or the Autodefensas?
That I don't know. I don't know, because my relationship was with Leonor. It wasn't with him. It was a separate thing.
Okay. I have heard of this before. I have heard of these couples. I think it's a shared hardship, I think, of an upbringing. I think that's where they come, and there's that mutual ground on that. I wanted to. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I think it's also, again, like what area of the country you live in and who your community is that gets you involved in whichever group that might be, and the era and time, right?
I'm curious. I mean, this story obviously came to you. It was something that you chased when you were at Columbia University, but there is a side to this that is obviously now 2 decades is very personal to you too, because you grew up, formative years in Colombia, and you and your family were under threat. And so I see, you don't, different situations altogether, but things where perhaps it gave you an opportunity to talk as an equal with Leonor in this. I mean, you and your family were under threat from kidnapping.
Well, I would never pretend to be like equal to Leonor. Like, it was completely different circumstances.
Sure. But the conflict continued.
But maybe the conflict, what happened is that the conflict made me a little bit more open and willing and to have tender feelings towards Leonor that maybe other people would not have.
An understanding.
Yes. Or so I grew up in Canada, and as most Canadians know, Canada is very open and understanding and happy and welcoming, or so it was to me in the mid-'80s when we arrived there. And in Canada, in Toronto, my Toronto that I remember, you grow up with a sense that everyone has some sort of goodness inside of them. And that if, like parents say, like, if you only look hard enough, there's always that person doing something good in the world. So I guess I came to Leonor with just a complete open canvas of like, what happened? What happened? And I recognized that she was probably the only person in the group home who was really open and kind to me about being transparent. There was one other boy, but I was more drawn and particularly interested to the woman's side, because all these horrendous things happen to women in Colombia, and they don't ever get a voice or a say. And even when they do, it's not them speaking, but it's some white male telling their story.
Yeah.
So I was drawn to truly get to Leonor and say, well, what happened? And it was very, very generous and kind. And this speaks volumes to how we should all be kind, that in her background, there was nothing for her to trust a white woman from Bogota with a Bogota accent. But yet we were able to form some sort of kinship. And I think that speaks to hope, peace, resilience.
Something positive, definitely. But you say you grew up in Canada, but that's because you guys left Colombia because of the threats.
Okay, so in the mid 1980s, 1983, 84, there was the M19, which it was an urban guerrilla group formed mostly of university kids. A lot from the countryside who were really smart, and there should have been spaces created for them at the time, but there weren't. So they all got together and decided to be rebellious because it was the time of the Vietnam War, Trotsky. From what I understand from interviewing a few of them, it was fashionable to be the rebel, to be Che Guevara, to go around in a motorcycle and meeting a spy in Cuba and whatnot. And actually a minister at the time, a government minister at the time, referred to them as simply as kids acting out. Well, this kids acting out decided that the FARC were not going to get anywhere because they were not bringing their fight to the cities. And that unless they brought the fight to the cities where the decision makers, political, economic, whatnot, social, were, nothing was ever going to change for people. So we were one of a few families. There were a lot of families who were threatened by the M19. And what I mean by that is that my family, my parents were told that the M19 were following our routines, where we went to school, where we tended to drop off and get candy if we were, where my ballet lesson was, all of these little things that would help them to kidnap somebody. Maybe me, and I was only 8 years old. So one day, the M19, they went into a university and they pulled from her classroom this young woman that was a family friend. And that evening, my father came home, and within 3 hours, both my mom and dad had decided, no, you're leaving. And 3 days later, we left for Toronto. It was a sense of displacement in which now as an adult, I remember my mother walking around the house, pensive, and picking up certain trinkets that she wanted to take with her that meant home to her, like frames, pictures, photographs of her side of the family, an ashtray. I remember an antique, a miniature antique clock, a vase that had belonged to my grandfather, things like that, that she could feel home in Toronto, which would be an entirely new experience for all of us. Although my older brother, was already in boarding school there in an hour from Toronto. And that was primarily the reason why my parents chose Toronto, because he was there. But also they were just very drawn to Canada.
Interesting. We need to jump in with the M19. Obviously, our current president, Gustavo Petro, was a member of the M19. When he lived in, I think it was Zipaquirá, is when he joined up and became an intellectual in that area and became, I guess, kind of theoretical. So I think, if I'm not wrong, you've interviewed members of the M19. Did you bring in sort of, versions of your upbringing to say, listen, I was under threat by you guys?
So I spent quite a bit of time with Vera Grave.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I was interested in the female woman version of how Vera Grave was able to be a commander in a male-dominated group. She again shared with me a lot of anecdotes of having been abused as a woman. She was told that she could not have children because as a woman and a commander, that's not the right thing to do. And that she didn't have that right because it wasn't what the group wanted for her. I found a lot of transparency again with Vera Grave in the way that we sat a few times in her office at the think tank. She had me up to her apartment, which I don't know where she lives now. I hope she's fine. I hope all is good with Vera. But she lived at the time in Bogota, overlooking the bull ring, La Plaza de los Toros, the bullfighting, the bullfighting ring. So, as a writer, I thought it was very appropriate that she opened up the shades and there was the bullfighting ring, and she commented to me that she loved to watch out the window when there were bullfights. And I thought, okay, she's very smart. I'm not sure if she's like trying to start some sort of intellectual bullfighting ring with me or something. But I was able to tell her that truly I thanked her for having allowed me to grow up elsewhere with different opportunities and different values, different friends, different outlooks than if I had just merely been a girl from Bogota. In some way, M19 displacing us and displacing my family, I got to have a really good education. I mean, I speak 3-4 languages. I got to go to Brown University. I got to go to Colombia. Maybe if I'd grown up from Bogota, I might have just been one of these country club wives.
Possible, you know, every weekend at Los Lagartos or something, or the country club. I think it's fascinating, and of course the M19, you know, it's really fascinating to me that a government minister calls them sort of students or young people acting up, because they're responsible for some of the most heinous, I mean, heinous and visual guerrilla attacks, especially, you know, the Palacio de Justicia, the Dominican Republic embassy. Remind me, there must be others that I can't remember. I mean, I know that they robbed a whole load of arms from the military depot, and I also know that they stole Bolivar's sword, which was very, of course, symbolic. But you know, these activities that they participated in were awful. I mean, and one thing that popped up in my mind while you were talking is I'm sure that the M19 obviously had their list probably written down of who to kidnap. Did she remember your name?
She did not.
Okay.
But I mean, I was very, very young.
Yeah.
But our family friend, who I've actually didn't use her real name in the book just for her privacy, because I know she's gone through a lot. I brought her up and she said, oh, she was lovely. Everyone loved her. She would actually assign boxes, cardboard boxes, to be pieces of furniture. And she would say, no, 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 don't sit there. This is the sofa. And she loved tea, like Earl Grey tea. So as Vera calls them, the compas, got together with their own money and bought her tea. And in turn, this young woman would say, well, you got to come over to tea, to my space. And when she started a dialogue with them about the M19, this young woman said that they should not kidnap people, but raise money through raffles and bingos. And they were endeared by her in that respect.
But I mean, she survived. She was pulled out of her class in university, which is shocking as well. How long was she held for?
Richard, I'd have to look back, but it's a couple of years.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's time. I mean, this is not an express kidnapping. There's a couple of years is serious.
Oh, it was years. And one of the anecdotes of the M19 is that when the night they got her, the commander laid out boxes and boxes of cornflakes and said, you see, you're here all this time. You got to go through all those cornflakes. That's just to give you an idea of how long you should expect to be here.
And where did they hold her?
I think they held her in Bogota.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when we read news of a kidnapping, the Gabriel Garcia Marquez one, it's all in Bogota, and sort of like, you know, these peripheral neighborhoods where the protagonists are of course held, which makes sense because these are kind of, you know, stateless parts of the city.
Right. Which, you know, Leonor's homes were in a lot of those stateless parts of the cities. It was the peripherals where The roads are no longer paved. You have to take 3 buses to get to Transmilenio.
What
The
does
water.
Leonor do now?
I'm sorry?
What does Leonor do now?
She's a mom.
Okay.
And so she washes the clothes in the river. She cooks. She watches the kids. She's a mom.
Yeah. But
I guess
she's
always expected to be,
yeah.
Not that she came out of her mold. Her life returned to what her mom's life was.
And she survived the massive flooding and landslides then in Mocoa. If she's in this, what was it? Must have been 2015.
Yes.
Yeah, because I did a lot of reporting on that, obviously. But
Yeah.
it's aggressive cattle farming, which has led to deforestation and all of these other things, and then there was a buildup of so much rainwater and this unstable ground that the river in Mocoa, but not even burst its banks, just took over most of the town. And of course, the hundreds of people who were killed were of course the most needy, the displaced, living in these very difficult and impossible situations alongside the river where people don't want to live. But she survived. Did she talk about that?
No, we did not talk about that.
It was an absolute tragedy. I mean, it was. Doesn't thinking about, actually. It's so horrible. And of course, the people came from around the world, rescue teams and so on, to help. I'm curious, Leonor now and her childhood, and of course as an adult, how you have been able over 2 decades to see how she has, again, you are, like, as you said earlier, it's like therapy. It's a catharsis for her to be able to put the record straight, I think, in a lot of times, as you mentioned earlier, no, she goes, Paula, it didn't happen that way. This has been something where she's been reconciling with her experiences to be able to therefore, explain to you really what happened.
And to herself, truly, more than me. I think for her, with me, it started as a game a little bit. The teenage game, and I took the bait. I was like, that's fine, no problem. But as the years went by and as we became adults, it was no longer really theatrics. I found that when we spoke a lot, or when I went through it with her, well, last time you said this, in 2002 you said this, in 2005 you realized this. That's the extent to how closely we went through it. It was a way for her to not only reconcile what had happened to her, but to put it in perspective, I guess, put it in blocks. Like you and I both know, like, okay, we started high school at this time, we were at this high school, all of that. But to her, all of that's very murky because of trauma, because of a lot of abuse. She also was into cocaine for a while. She abused alcohol for a while, which is not surprising. It's readily available to her and she's having a hard time. Right? There's nothing else that can help sort of soothe her. She would say, oh, I just really like whiskey.
Is this while she was in the guerrilla or afterwards?
A little bit of both. Apparently cocaine in her circle in the guerrilla was very readily available.
Putumayo.
Which is not surprising.
Yeah. Biggest narcotics trafficking. That's fascinating because, in a lot of, when you talk to, former guerrillas and stuff, they always talk about how this was off limits. And they don't participate and they just tax and so on and so forth. I mean, they play the media very well, but to hear it from you, to have heard it from Leonor that she did have access to all of this is certainly quite striking.
But again, remember, she was first girl, right? She got what she wanted. She also asked for clothing. She asked for face creams. She wanted perfume. She got the perfume. She had a camera and she posts like you and like people we know on Instagram. Not that she had an Instagram, but so how she was able to, with the help of the psychiatrist later, was a lot of the photos in her camera, putting them together with photos of other people that they had. And she could say, oh yeah, I was there and this and that. And that's also how the government soldiers were able to say. So when they found her, she was hiding in a house pretending to be a farmer. And as she says to me, it was so ridiculous that I even pretended to be a farmer, because the cap around her was of the suntan or sunburn that she had, which was minutes before. Her nose was scorched. Her hands were bleeding from carrying wood and equipment and all these things. She was not a farmer. It was very easily for the government soldiers to identify who she was. But she left her pack outside the house and her camera was in it. And they went through it and said, bang, well, who are you? And so again, a little bit of the abuse came. Oh, we found the commander's whore. That kind of thing from the government soldiers, which goes both ways, right? Again, towards women. Again,
the machista society.
Again, towards women, but again, towards a 17-year-old. Very clearly a minor, because her body was minute. Minute from having survived 10 days or so in 10 days or so in the bush, with hardly any food. Her and her compañeros were surviving on panela, the brown sugar, the cubes of brown sugar, which of course have a lot of calories, you and I know, but that they were surviving on that. She was minute. She had a fever. She probably already was going through a lot of the STDs that cause fevers. So yeah.
Well, I'm going to be the first in line, maybe not in Coral Gables, to get the book, because I've been kind of following following this document for again about a decade, and I want to get it. Where you've told us that it will be Books and Books, January the 28th, 2024. That's on Aragon Avenue in Coral Gables, 4 p.m. for those of you who are in Florida. But where will I be able to get it after that?
So you can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop. Yeah. And if you all click on my author website, just pauladelgadokling.com, you will see reviews. I will keep posting about other events around the book. It's still only October, so there's a lot of planning still to do for January. And then follow me on Instagram and I'll let you all know how it goes.
Well, no, because we're going to have you back in January after the launch, so that you can tell us about the experience, the emotional experience of finally getting that book out here. I
know. It's been a while, right, Richard?
Hey, I understand it fully, though, but it's so exciting.
Her story, though, in her story and the way to tell it and the narrative and finding the right voice. As I have this great agent, she just kept saying, it just is. Those kinds of books take that amount of time.
It's tiring, isn't it? Because the story...
It's considered maybe memoir, but it's also biography. It's also war and conflict. It's child rights. It's a lot of different things that don't fit into one. And just think about it. You have to go out, get the information, corroborate the information. The information's wrong. Why? Go back. There's her story. There's my story. There's historical story. There's the voice. Yeah.
Remind us of the title, Paula.
Leonor, the story of a lost childhood.
So
and
there you go, folks.
Or books.
Okay. There you are. We're going to get it. We're going to buy it. I'm going to get it. And then when you're in Bogota, you're going to sign it for us all of us.
Bogota. We'll have a book launch in New York.
Yeah.
And we're working on several other cities. Let's see, Boston, Chicago, maybe. Let's see, LA,
Ooh.
maybe. It's still
I'm more likely to be in LA. Well, fantastic. Yeah. No, if you have an event here in Bogota, we will definitely be here, and of course we'll announce it on the podcast and all over social media and all the ills, and we'll get all the people there to come and buy the book. And Paula, thank you so much for your time. I'm so very excited, and I know it's going to be a great success.
I think, well, my success is really Leonor having trusted me with her story.
That's very humble, but you had to get it out there too.
It is. If that young woman hadn't opened up to me, I wouldn't have been able to write this book or understand half the things that now make a little bit more sense to me.
Well, yeah, there's that. There definitely is that. I mean, I guess it really is. And this story, Leonor's story, accompanies you in so long. I mean, it's become, it's not a life's work, because there's still plenty of life to live, but it's become a major life project.
Yes, I think I go back to a quote by Joan Didion in which she says, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at. And I guess Leonor's story was a mirror to that for Colombia.
That's a great quote. We can rely on Joan Didion.
Yeah.
Well, we'll bring this to a close now. But thank you so much for sharing this in such. I mean, it's clear, the way that you have developed an understanding of what Leonor's story is, to be able to put the narrative and, of course, run parallel a little bit to your family's childhood and what you guys experienced. But it's her story, as you mentioned, but interviews with people like Vera Grave make this as well, a great document. So we have been talking to Paula Delgado Kling, and you will find her book everywhere you get books. It's called Leonor, The Story of a Lost Childhood. I'll plug it one more time. January the 28th, Books and Books. That's at 265 Aragon Avenue in Coral Gables at 4 p.m. Be there. Right. So thank you again, everyone who's been listening. We'll be back next week with more stories from or about or by Colombia. So thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.